Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. A few points of housekeeping before we start. It's scheduled to last for an hour and a half. We'll try and include some questions and answers at the very end, but in the likelihood that we won't have an opportunity to do that, we'll share that with all participants post the webinar in the coming days. And please post those questions in the Q&A function, which you'll find. As I said, it's scheduled to last for an hour and a half, and the focus of today's webinar is less talk and more action, in essence. It's obviously entitled, as you can see there, Overcoming the Challenges of Net Zero and Making your next steps count. We all heard lots of chatter at COP26, and there's been a lot of talk in the last few years particularly, but it's now beginning to transition, if you like, into action, and it's absolutely critical that we start doing things to make net zero a reality. Just a little bit about JRP as an introduction for those of you who don't know us. JRP are regarded as being the UK's leading independent net zero energy and outsourcing specialist, working with clients across a number of sectors, helping them to develop appropriate net zero strategies, and more importantly, or as importantly, helping them to implement them in a very practical sense. So we're very much at the forefront of turning talk into action. Can I have the next slide, please, Rob? Thank you. Today's presenters, as you can see there, Rose Gallery, our keynote speaker is Professor James Longhurst from UWE at Bristol, and I'll let James say a few words about himself, and also a number of my colleagues, Jez Rutter, who's the Managing Director and founder of JRP Solutions, Michael Diamond, who's the Energy Officer at Bournemouth University, Carol Sumber, who's the Director of Sustainability at JRP Solutions, very experienced sustainability professional, and one of our bright sparks at JRP, Connie Heathfield. Next slide, please. So what we're going to be covering in the next hour and a half is these four agenda items here. And we've been asked a number of questions by clients and others, particularly in the last 18 months or so, as momentum has really begun to grow exponentially. One of the questions that was put to me a couple of months ago was, well, the UK is responsible for only 1% of global carbon emissions. So why does what we do here in the UK count? Why aren't we focused on China or India or other countries that emit far more? So we'll be talking a little bit about that because it is an interesting challenge. And we'll also be talking about the government's net zero strategy, which focuses primarily on technological improvements. So, there's been a lot of press and a lot of talk around, the role of air source and ground source heat pumps, for instance, solar, wind, other renewables. So why does what we do count? So that's talking about behaviour change, which the Committee for Climate Change stated could account for approximately 50% of all greenhouse gas reductions could come from changes in behaviours. And the beauty about changing behaviours, as opposed to investing in technology, it's sustainable. Once you change culture and once you change individuals' behaviours, it's something that lasts forever. And it's also extremely low cost. So it's a great investment to make. Jez will be talking a little bit more about that. He's very passionate about behaviour change. And then we'll talk about, well, we do only have one chance to get this right. Time is running short. We have to achieve net zero. We have to limit global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees. Otherwise, we will reap the consequences. And that's global consequences for all of us. This isn't something that, as we all know, happens in some far-flung corner of the world and doesn't touch us. It very much will. It'll touch our ability to grow food, it'll impact our infrastructure, it'll impact our daily lives. So we really do have a responsibility on all of us to do what we can and take those steps to make net zero actually happen. And then at the very end, we'll talk about what we might be able to do individually and at an organizational level to make this a reality. And next slide, please, Rob. So over to Professor James Longhurst.
Oh, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, JRP Solutions, for the invitation to spend about 10 minutes just providing a bit of background to why this is such a critical issue. This is a climate emergency. We can't pretend anything else. This is probably the most serious thing that faces global humanity. So I've been active in this field since 1989, researching and advising national, international organizations, local government, universities on how they can manage their carbon more efficiently, more effectively, and how they can make their contribution to reducing global heating. Currently, I've just come to the end of a couple of years as a climate commissioner for higher education. That was a commission established to support universities across the United Kingdom making their contribution in advance of COP. And locally, of course, I lead my own universities, the University of the West of England's net zero activities alongside our sustainability agenda. And I help Bristol City Council and South Gloucestershire Council, our two local councils, with their climate emergency work. So let's just reflect on the background to the net zero agenda that you're going to follow today. We cast our minds back to COP, to Glasgow in November of last year. As COP commenced, the global concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere approached 414 parts per million, roughly 149% above pre-industrial levels. And we had an increase in global temperature of about 1.1 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial level. And that's despite all the research, all the knowledge, all the actions that had already been taken to bring together the global knowledge base and global actions coordinated through the UN and the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it is somewhat depressing that the world in that 30 odd years released more CO2 than from 1990 onwards, when we really got serious about the climate emergency. We released more CO2 in that period than in all the recorded period before. And if we don't take the actions that net zero requires, we're going to see ourselves finding a global temperature at the end of the century somewhere around 3 degrees C, or even higher, according to some predictions. Now, the Glasgow COP gave us some hope that maybe the agreements reached there in what was called the Glasgow Pact might keep global warming to maybe 2.4 degrees above that pre-industrial level. Now, you will cast your mind back even further to the Paris COP, where the ambition was to restrain the rise in temperatures to somewhere around 2 degrees and ideally less than 2 degrees. And emerging out of that was the ambition for restraining to 1.5 degrees. So we've got a gap still, a gap that COP26 didn't close, but made some progress. It made progress, but maybe not enough progress. Although many people think COP26 achieved a lot more than the mood music leading up to it might have suggested. And I'll come on just to say a few highlights about what COP26 actually did. But I just want to remind you that we are in a period where the climate emergency has become ever more apparent. Just yesterday, I noted that NASA confirmed that 2021 was the 6th warmest year on record. And of course, we know from the work of the World Meteorological Organization that the world has experienced a period of exceptional warming and exceptional retreating of ice and record sea level changes driven by historic and current greenhouse gas emissions. And in the 5-year period 2015 to 2019, and in the 10-year period 2010 to 2019, the WMO recorded these as being the highest temperatures ever recorded by our meteorological colleagues. So we are already seeing dramatic changes in the global climate, and we are seeing dramatic changes driven by that 1.1 degree temperature increase. Extreme events such as heat waves, droughts, flooding, winter storms, hurricanes, wildfires, they're increasing in frequency and the impact, their magnitude. So these are going to get even worse. At 1.5 degrees, they will be worse. And if those higher predictions are actually to be realized, goodness knows what we will actually see. So if we think about COP26, what did that offer us? Well, COP26 set out essentially 4 foci: action on mitigation, action on adaptation, action on finance, and action on collaboration. So if I summarize some headlines as I saw them, the good news was about 90% of the countries present at COP26 now have a net zero nationally NDC, nationally determined contribution towards the global reduction. 80+ countries have an adaptation plan. We've seen some progress on the $100 billion per year climate finance initiative, but that won't be realized until 2023. And that global sum is about helping those countries most at risk from the changing climate, the low and middle income countries in particular. We saw new rules and regulations being agreed to enhance transparency of emission reporting and timescales. All very good, but the enforcement of these, of course, is the critical element. For the first time, we had agreement on the phasing out of coal, although some countries, of course, abstained from that agreement. And phasing out coal is a critical component of any strategy to get anywhere close to net zero. What was really encouraging was the methane agreement that was announced prior to the start of COP. Methane is an absolutely important element in the hope for net zero. And what we also saw was the rise of the conversation within the COP agenda about nature-based solutions and the halting and reversing of deforestation, and lots of conversations about active travel and electrification of mobility. So if we think about the package of outcomes from Glasgow, known as the Glasgow Climate Pact, we see that 1.5 degrees C still just about in sight, just about. The hope now is that the actions between now and November of this year, when COP27 convenes in Egypt, is that there will be concerted and rapid action to bring together all of those agreements into things that can push the 1.5 degrees ambition over the line and have in place the agreements that will actually deliver on the mitigation measures that are required, but also to reinforce the commitments to adaptation, because we've baked in to the climate system change that will require massive global action to protect the most vulnerable around the world, and particularly in low and middle income countries. But the United Kingdom will not find itself immune from those changes, and we will need to see significant action in the United Kingdom. And it was good to see the raft of policy and strategy announcements by UK and devolved governments in the run-up to COP. I know you're going to talk about the net zero strategy as part of this morning's agenda, but there were lots of important highlights that one could note about the government's ambition for net zero by 2050. At the moment, what we see is that ambition in the strategy. What we need to see is the alignment of those activities with the very clear advice from the Committee on Climate Change about the pathway to 2050 and net zero from the United Kingdom as a whole. So we have the rhetoric. What we now need to see is the reality of that playing out in not just technological change, but to pick up a point George made in his introduction, the absolute importance of societal and individual behavioral change to support the implementation of those technological changes that will have, in many cases, quite profound impacts on the way we live our lives. So there is, at the local, at the UK level, a lot of ambition and a lot of opportunity. By 2030, we will, according to the Committee on Climate Change, need to have seen a 68% reduction in our emissions. By 2035, that's ramped up to 78%. We're running out of time to make the implementations that are necessary. So it's critically important that conversations like the one you are to have this morning will really get to grips with not the why question, because I hope I've covered why it is so important. It's the what, the where, the when, and the who with the how. And that's what this morning's conversation can really bring to the fore. How can all the elements of UK PLC play their part in driving out carbon from their business, from understanding their contribution and doing what they can as quickly as is possible to remove that carbon from each, what is called the scope 1, 2, and 3 of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol as quickly as is possible. And if you're unfamiliar with those terms, I'm sure JRP Solutions will be only too pleased to share a jargon busting session with you at another time. So with that, George, can I hand back to you? Thank you very much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that has set up a context for the conversation that George and colleagues will now take you through. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you. Rob, can you move the slides on, please? Okay, so yeah, going back to one of the key agenda points and building on what James has just shared with us there. The question that I was asked by a client a number of weeks ago was, the UK is responsible for only 1% of global carbon emissions, so why does what we do count? Next slide, please, Rob. Next slide, thank you. Okay, so we see huge container ships arriving at our ports every day. And these container ships are bringing in goods and products and of all sorts, many of which we used to manufacture ourselves, but are now coming from as far afield as China, America, Japan, India, Europe, of course. And what we have to think about is the nature of these goods and challenge ourselves as to what we need. Do we need it or do we want it at an individual level, particularly? An organizational level, asking ourselves a question about where are they coming from? How are they actually made? And I'll expand on that in a moment. Next slide, please, Rob. So the origin of UK's imported goods in 2020 looked like this. So you can see there, 12% was coming from China, and almost the same, 11.6% was coming from the US, with 9.2% coming from Germany. This is all measured in US dollars. And next slide, please. But in terms of GHG emissions by economy, and this is not the same year, this is 2017, but it won't be far off. Similarly, China accounts for almost a quarter of global GHG emissions. And that says to me that we're clearly not the only country that are contributing towards having made China essentially the factory of the world. The USA account for 19%. I think that's slightly changed. They have a huge manufacturing base still in the United States. And so that says that, as you can see from the previous slide, a lot of what we're buying is obviously coming from abroad, and it's coming from places such as China, USA, India, and others. Europe particularly is a big trading partner, and therefore we are accountable for some of those emissions. You know, we can't absolve ourselves of that responsibility just because it's not made here, and you can't see, you know, chimney stacks with, you know, greenhouse gases emitting from those stacks. It's happening somewhere else, out of sight, out of mind, I guess. Next slide, please. And then when you start to look at your supply chains, it also then starts to uncover things such as workers' rights, the way workers are treated, how much they're paid, their living and working conditions, and other issues. And you can't ignore those. This isn't just about GHG emissions, and it's really important to understand your supply chains and not absolve yourself of that responsibility. I've seen, you know, a number of documentaries, and I'm sure we all have, on companies like Apple, for instance, who said, no, our supply chains are great. We have all these policies in place, and we audit our suppliers. But how good are those audits? How far down the supply chain do they go? Because I've seen some real horror stories, and we have to take responsibility both as a consumer as to what and where and from whom we buy our products, and also at an organizational level where it's not good enough to buy through brokers and just accept what you're being told. You need to understand what's going on, because not only does that help you in terms of the broader CSR benefits and issues, because it also helps you to understand the risks and opportunities within those supply chains. It also will help you to engage your key suppliers in particular and develop better relationships with them, and to encourage them to not necessarily mirror exactly what you're doing, but encourage them to start reducing their own GHG emissions, because their GHG emissions are your scope 3. Next slide, please. I love this picture because it says all sorts of things to me. But obviously during lockdown, a lot of people turned to internet shopping. Amazon delivered millions and millions and millions of goods, probably a lot of which we didn't actually need, but we thought we wanted. So that's a challenge I make to myself before I buy everything, anything that is do I need it or do I want it? And it's okay to treat yourself now and again. But in all cases, I'd say take responsibility, understand what you're buying, where it's coming from, the nature of the product. You know, is there a sustainable and affordable option? A challenge to be made. But as organizations, as businesses who have big supply chains and are buying millions and millions of pounds worth of goods every year, we need to be very mindful of that and understand what's in our supply chains and take responsibility for it. Next slide, please. And without picking on Amazon, but Amazon are one of these that have a good marketing campaign. They show a young engineer on the roof of one of their distribution warehouses with lots of solar panels and saying how green they are. And others have done similar things. So it's not just Amazon. But there's a clip here which will take you to an ITV investigation, which showed that because of the business model that Amazon has in place, there gets to a point where it's no longer commercially viable for their suppliers of goods to continue to have those goods stored in Amazon's warehouses. So what happens to them? They end up getting skipped. That is criminal, absolutely criminal. So you can put as many solar panels on roofs as you like, in my view, but your scope 1, scope 2 emissions actually are dwarfed by your scope 3 emissions. And if you are putting solar panels on the roof and putting in a nice glossy advert, a marketing campaign, but you're doing this sort of practice, that's far more fundamental and far more important than solar panels. Sorry, that's me on my soapbox. Next slide, please, Rob. So in conclusion, we cannot outsource our responsibilities or our emissions. Yes, the UK might directly only account for approximately 1% of global greenhouse emissions, but our choices, organisations and individual consumers contribute towards the climate emergency. As we all know, global warming doesn't happen purely on a regional basis or within your own country or your own town or city. This is a global emergency, and we all have to take responsibility for it. So a better understanding of our supply chains is absolutely critical to achieving our net zero targets and helping to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. Next slide, please, Rob. So I think this is going over to Jez.
No, it's me actually.
Was it? Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Just going back to where we started, George, you said that the government strategy focuses mainly on technical improvements. So why does what we do count? To achieve net zero, the culture and behaviours of an organisation need to change to ensure that engagement, awareness and commitment are fully embedded. James used the term baked in, and that's an excellent analogy. So we know, for example, that at least 50% of the available energy improvements potential within an organisation is related to the culture, the structure of the business and the processes of that organisation. So I'd like to talk to you all now about engaging the board. This is culture change. So next slide, please, Rob. Next slide. There's a really interesting report, research report produced by the Financial Reporting Council in 2016. And its chair, Lord Bishkoff, said that in his opening statement, a healthy culture both protects and generates value. That's absolutely true, really important. And he said, it's important to have a continuous focus on culture rather than wait for a crisis. We are in a crisis now, as James outlined, and if we don't do something about climate change in terms of business culture, again, for the reasons that George has just stated, then we really are missing a massive opportunity to protect and generate the value of our organisation. And Lord Bishkoff, in his statement, said that a strong culture will endure in times of stress and mitigate the impact. This is essential in dealing effectively with risk and maintaining resilient performance. So getting climate change, getting carbon emissions accounting embedded in the culture of an organisation is absolutely the best place to start, because the culture of the board will set the tone for the entire organisation for how it operates. So next slide, please. It's important to sort out where you're starting from. You may have already done this. I'm conscious that people listening in today may be at different points in this journey. So, but if you're starting out from scratch, look at where your organisation is now. And Climate Action 100 produced their first ever net zero company scorecard in March last year. And it's worth looking at that graphic and going onto their website and looking at the details in a bit more in a bit more depth. It's important to start with the company's or any organisation's mission statement, the business objectives and the policies. What do they say about the importance of net zero? As James said, is that baked into what the organisation is doing? So see where your organisation measures up, where you measure up within your industry sector. Next slide, please. New corporate sustainability trends forecast by Resonance Global for the coming year has issued, I think, around 5 main factors. These are 3 of them I think are really important. That we're going to see the increasing integration of environmental and social impact objectives in corporate strategy. So integration is absolutely key. Get social, environmental and economic out of their silos and put them together. Use systems thinking. They talk about greater scrutiny of net zero claims with a focus on addressing Scope 3 emissions for the very reasons that George has just explained. They're absolutely massive. Net zero is not about your scopes 1 and 2, it's about all scopes together. And very interestingly and importantly, the trends forecast says that there will be increasing disillusionment with ESG in the old conventional sense, and it's going to open the door for what they're calling net positive thinking. So let's get out of those silos and get away from greenwashing. Net zero is not about moving to green energy tariffs and offsetting the rest. That's not what it's about. It's really committing to reducing your total greenhouse gases. So Microsoft have made a very explicit pledge, and they've gone back beyond 1990 to their emissions since their founding in 1975, which is excellent. And Kering Group, who I've talked about before, they have a net positive impact, and they're particularly focusing on biodiversity to achieve this by 2025. And they're doing it through a really interesting insetting approach, and they're working with their supply chain right at the raw materials production stage, at the very bottom of their supply chain, to start helping those businesses that they rely on to get regenerative practices into place. Kering Group own big luxury fashion brands, including Bottega Veneta, Gucci, so that they're in the apparel sector. They are setting the way, and they have a triple bottom line approach to their impacts identification and strategies for reduction. So they're a great one to look at. Next slide, please. If you're looking at corporate change and the route into the board, it's important to ask who needs to be involved from across the business. Marshal your forces. Think about personalities. Who are real leaders that you need to get into that team, and who are the blockers, the people that you've really got to influence and bring around to your way of thinking. When I worked at ADAS years ago, the FM head of FM was a really difficult personality to try and bring on board around sustainability in general. But once I'd explained to him why it was important and what the benefits for his role were, he was my biggest advocate. It worked. So you've got to swing those people around. Think about where the evidence is going to come from, both within your organisation but also externally. I've put this graphic up. It's MPA Concrete, and they've mapped out in a really visual way what their route map is going to look like, and where they can start to make some really good reductions. So see if you can do something similar for your business, and look at what's in your existing business strategy that you can use as a hook, and really think about the time frame that will fit not just within your business strategy, but how your business works, the cycle of board meetings, the lead time for these. What are you going to have to do to get the evidence together and then plugged into that system well in advance to make sure it actually gets to that critical board meeting? Next slide, please. Look across the whole organisation and identify the existing working groups and committees that you can use, and how you're going to make best use of those, and getting agreement on establishing a new one if what's already in place isn't going to quite fit. It's getting all of those wheels and cogs into place, and again reviewing your existing objectives and looking at the outcomes and seeing if you need to change any of that. Do you have the right standard operating procedures in place, the SOPs? Are you certificated to ISO 14001? And bear in mind also that that's changing. There's a new upgraded standard being published in this year. I'm not quite sure of the timing, but that is almost certainly going to be focusing more on the whole net zero agenda and how to make that really crunchy and work well within organisations. IMS stands for Integrated Management System. So that's bringing together your quality, systems, your health and safety, your environmental, your corporate, what would traditionally be called corporate social responsibility. Make it all integrated, bake it in, and make sure that it's all working together. A last point here, champions are absolutely fantastic, and when you get the right people involved, it can make a massive difference. But formalise that. Look at what's written into post-holder job descriptions and performance objectives, because if you lose one or two really great advocates for change from your business, you've got to make sure that their replacements have that as part of their job description, as part of their reason for being in the organisation. So please look at that really closely. Next slide, please. When you're getting your champion, your leader on board with this change, if you can sign up the Chief Executive Officer, that's absolutely brilliant. But you'll need at least one board director, preferably two, and get that formal sponsorship of your internal project. That person's got to lead the ambition, they've got to be your spokesperson on the board, and they've got to make sure that net zero is integrated into business strategy. So good leadership will really establish the route to net zero, and they'll do it in a way that's pragmatic, that fits with the tone and style of the organisation, and will help to set a stretching but realistic timeframe for this. And there's a quote there from, again, the FRC report, Rob Noel, Chief Executive of Land Securities, and he talks about driving culture. It's a key part of his job as a board member, as Chief Executive, and that he expects the board to hold his feet to the fire over making sure that positive change is active and happening at pace. Next slide, please. The strategy, net zero strategy, needs to be enshrined in the business strategy. It's got to be absolutely core and centre for that. Again, the FRC report, a culture is created by what you do rather than what you say. So the net zero strategy and progress in achieving it needs to be a standing item on the executive team's agenda. They've got to be hard objectives and milestones. There needs to be an enabling processes and procedures across the organisation, so the organisation is net zero approved. And again, going back to the importance of individual post-holder job descriptions, those objectives and targets have to be translated down into and embedded in what people are doing at every level of the organisation. Next slide, please. And I'll hand back, I'm handing over, having talked about culture change, and now handing over to Jez, who's going to talk about behaviour change, which is taking it down to that next level of detail.
Good morning, everybody. Hope you're enjoying what you've heard so far. Much more to come. Next slide, please, Rob. So, what I'm going to be talking about is how behaviour change is a key element of all organisations achieving net zero. When it's embedded and sustained, and those two words are really important. I'll be demonstrating why we talk about 50% of the energy efficiency potential shortly. I just want to make a quick, two quick plugs of things that have been mentioned. I don't know if you realised that at the very first slide of this conference, that we showed that we are a B Corp organisation, and I would recommend highly that people consider doing that, and also that JRP as an organisation have a triple bottom line written into its Articles of Association. That's just prompted to that from what Carol just said. Next slide, please. So to explain what we mean by holistic, I should explain that there are over 140 different behaviour change interventions that are logged. And we would suggest that for a program on behavior change to be holistic, that at least 40% of these 140 interventions should be implemented at the same time as part of a long-term strategy. In reference to the momentum phrase right at the beginning, well, some of these 140 interventions have got momentum and some of them don't. It's important when planning to get the balance right in terms of how you're actually going to enable and run a behavior change program. A little bit like making a cake, you need to mix the ingredients to get the most optimum solution. And those are going to be different for each particular company. So planning is one of the most important aspects, following a gap analysis. And the gap analysis is key because it says where you are, where you want to get to, and if done well, it should also determine the size of the opportunity, the resources that you'll need, the timescales, objectives, and so on and so forth. So if we now go to the next slide, please, Rob. There's a video here. So in most organizations, it's very well recognized that the potential for reducing energy consumption is approximately 50%. If we only used what we actually needed, we can realistically cut consumption, energy consumption, by 50%. And of that, only 25% of that energy efficiency reduction will come from technical projects. If we go on to the next slide, please, Rob. The other 25% will come from behavior change. And that might sound rather staggering, and certainly in discussions with government that we're having, we haven't quite got the message home yet. Many technical projects, just to put that into context, many technical projects require behaviors to be right, for technology to be optimized. That is part of behavior change. There are things that are purely behavior change, but a lot of the figure that I've just quoted is actually the optimization of technology. So our evidence shows that on a very initial basis, perhaps after a couple of years, the range of savings could easily be 10 to 25% of a site's energy consumption. So why aren't enough people doing this? Well, there's aspects such as, do people believe that it'll work? Do they think that it will be sustained? And as I say, will you be able to measure the savings? Well, if you don't do it on a holistic basis, it's not going to be a surprise that you won't be able to necessarily measure the savings. So it needs to be holistic, it needs to have momentum built into the program, and it needs to be set up such that it lasts. For example, the very point that Carol made at the end of her presentation, these things need to be baked into people's personal review processes, targets, objectives, and so on and so forth. So what we need to do is really take forward behavior change programs. And if I go on to the next slide, I'll just give you an example of, sorry, I'm just waiting to see the next slide. I don't know if my signal's slow. Thank you. So we can see here, which is a double whammy surprise, that behavior change projects are extremely low payback. And I think the longest payback we've actually seen from the different case studies is about 10 months. We sometimes propose that it might be a little bit longer. So perhaps some people don't like the phrase low-hanging fruit, but in the context of energy efficiency and reducing consumption, then behavior change also fits into that category. So one of the disappointing things from COP26, in my view, and I thought Jim's introduction was very good, was that behavior and people weren't mentioned really in COP at all. In fact, the impression that you get is quite the reverse, that actually people don't need to do anything, technology will solve the problem. Well, I'm telling you now, it won't. And all organizations really need to start looking at behavior change as a key and actually a fast mechanism towards getting towards net zero. Next slide, please. So what are the behavior change interventions? Well, I've taken that 146 different behavior change interventions, and actually they are all categorized into 9 different areas, some of them in very much detail. I'm not going to run down these, so if you could have a look. But these are 9 sort of categories. As I say, some of them have real momentum built into them. So, for example, if you put things into people's targets, you're measuring it year on year, then that is something that maintains momentum. If you're having a launch event for a behavior change program, then it doesn't have any momentum at all, and other interventions have some momentum. So this is all about how you balance the cake. Next slide, please. So what I've put on this next slide is a number of different examples of case studies, and just to show the sort of range of potential savings. But I would just stress, and I'll repeat it on the next slide, that not all of these projects were holistic, and where they were holistic, i.e. they delivered about 30 or 40% of the different interventions, then the potential for these savings to actually increase is still very much there. Next slide, please. You'll also have seen on that particular slide that some of those need very little financial investment, but what they do need is ongoing commitment and a very good structure, as well as clearly buy-offs from senior managers, directors in an organization, which is one of the common threads across all behavior change programs, is that they must have that senior commitment. The resource that's required needs to be stipulated. In that example at Rolls-Royce, for example, the champions and others involved actually timesheeted everything. It was actually stopped after a year because it was just seemed to be so effective, but it was initially a timesheeted component. The other thing is understanding, when you're in the early stages of planning a behavior change program, a clear understanding of the resource that's actually going to be required and some of the steps. And one, for example, that I put in here is that it's very effective. Another fairly common thing between behavior change programs is to have a red-lined fund is very effective. For very small projects, it actually helps momentum again, that organizations, champions, who perhaps are not the most senior in the organization, but they can very quickly call on a fund, perhaps for projects less than £1,000, to actually get something done, so that people actually start to see the interventions actually taking place, which incentivizes them and others to look for more. And having that fund is a very good component of all behavior change programs. Next slide, please. So what are the steps required? And next slide as well, please. The first step, as I've alluded to, is to develop a gap analysis. I'll again let you have a look at the small wording below. Each step has got a number of different characteristics, but I just want to go through the headlines. I haven't got time to go through everything, but a gap analysis, as I say, will really say where you are, where you want to get to, what can be achieved, how quickly it can be achieved. Then you need a much more detailed strategy to actually get there. And then what you need is a co-designing of all of the interventions that you're actually going to take place. And this is very much best done on a team basis with buy-in. Next slide, please. The next thing, which perhaps might be an optional thing actually, but usually it does have an impact so that everyone knows about this new initiative, is to actually launch the intervention. And surprise, surprise, then it's into sort of implementation. And the implementation phase for a behavior change program can typically, well, it's ongoing, but in the first instance, it's typically a sort of 3 to 9 month program. Don't necessarily introduce every intervention all at once, but they're all in a planned block. And we mustn't forget that it's really important to also measure, and the measurement of a behavior change program needs to be planned actually right at the beginning as part of the strategy, such that you know what you're going to measure when you get to this later stage of actually measuring. And behavior change savings don't happen overnight, but after 6, 9 or 12 months, depending on the structure of the program, then you will be able to do that. Next slide, please. So very, very briefly, what you'll do at this stage is report back on your measurements, ideally using IPMVP as a protocol approach, because that would give complete confidence to the figures that you're then communicating. And then what you'd normally do is refine intervention and approach into a phase 2, perhaps for each approximately 12-month period. So, so those are the steps that would typically be involved in a behavior change program. And if we now move on to my last slide, as I've said, the best case studies that we've shown still haven't fully implemented every aspect of behavior change, and neither should they to start with, but there is room to grow and improve and embed and bake in. I would say that behavior change is an essential ingredient of a net zero plan. Certainly it would boost the impact in terms of its timescale. And when you add that to the fact that payback periods are very low, I don't see why any organization would not actually be keen to implement a behavior change program. So I'm now going to hand back to George. So thank you for your time.
So what do we learn about behaviour from lockdown, which obviously is a nice follow-on from Carol's and Jez's presentations. So next slide, please, Rob. So this is a site that, whilst it's now, 18 months ago, is still very fresh in my memory, as I'm sure it is for many others on this webinar. We all remember basically being locked down in our homes, not being able to go to the shops, not be able to do the things that we would normally do. And at first it seemed very, very strange, but there was a sense of togetherness within the country at first. Next slide, please. But I think there were some key learnings from this. Life changed, it changed radically, and it changed very quickly. And I think what was shown was what was previously thought to be all too difficult proved to be possible. Leaders needed to lead by example. And legislation enforced change to happen. So it wasn't a question of choice. It was a question of we didn't have a choice, we had to do something. And organisations had to ensure that people had the right tools to enable them to work from home. And not everyone has an appropriate environment in which to work. So I think what it also did was to personalise relationships within organisations, and indeed between organisations. You know, we've all been on Team and Zoom calls where a cat's run across the desk or a child's run into the room, etc. And it really does help to personalise things, You know, even the attire, you don't sit at home wearing a suit and shirt, do you? So I think it really helped. It was beneficial from that perspective. There were lots of unforeseen benefits of doing things differently. There was increased productivity, at least in terms of those that work in more sort of office-based environments, and particularly in large cities, because it meant that people weren't having to undertake that arduous and stressful commute into work and back home again. It also meant that there was a better work-life balance for many. You know, we all remember rediscovering nature and the countryside and taking advantage of lockdown, enabling us to go out and enjoy the benefits of that. And luckily, in the lockdown of 2020, in the UK at least, we enjoyed one of the finest summers we've had for a long time, which was fantastic. And I think in all of that, it helped people to reevaluate things, not just their personal lives, but also at an organizational level. You know, should this become the new norm? What were the benefits of it? I mean, one of the obvious benefits that we all were aware of during the time of lockdown, UK emissions reduced by 7%. Less of us were traveling, quite clearly. You know, fewer buildings were being lit and heated and cooled. But I think the other thing we needed to do was to be aware of the downsides and mitigating them. As I said, you know, working from home doesn't suit everybody. You know, some of us need that social interaction to develop relationships and to give them a more sort of dynamic working environment. So it doesn't suit everyone, and we did need to be, and we do need to continue to be aware of that. And I think we're reaching a point now, perhaps we're reaching a better balance as an organisation, organisationally and individually. But one of the things that was very apparent to me and to others was good communication, absolutely paramount to success. I mean, some of the lessons and the benefits, certainly at an organisational level, was organisations that were particularly office-based started to ask themselves, well, with half our workforce working from home, or perhaps in some cases all of our workforce working from home, this is actually working. Why can't it continue to work in that way? Do we actually need to have this large estate? You know, can we downsize the estate, which would obviously have huge financial and, of course, environmental benefits for organisations. And some organisations, in fact, a lot of organisations have made some of those changes permanent. It's a new way of working. Next slide, please, Rob. And next slide. Thank you. So it's back to Carol.
Okay, next slide, please, Rob. I'm just going to run quickly through some really important things to make sure that you're working on, so that you are setting a roadmap to net zero in place. And the first one is to establish your trajectory to net zero. There are different targets for different sectors. Construction globally has a target of 2040 for net zero. They want to be a bit more ambitious than the 2050 global target, which the UK has adopted. NHS UK have split their targets into two: direct control, their scopes 1 and 2 by 2040 at the latest, with an 80% reduction there earlier if they can do it. And then indirect, their supply chain, their scope 3 by 2045. Again, trying to pull forward the government's 2050 target. So how does your organisation measure up within your sector? And the graphic just gives you, this is from a KPMG report looking at the banking and finance sector, setting out what the business as usual trajectory would look like depending on what you're doing now. What would your science-based trajectory look like? And this is the Paris Agreement. So COP26 may change that. And then looking at where removals or offsets come in. So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to say a little bit more about setting a science-based target. And the graphic from Qantas, an American consultancy, is quite good. It's showing the measures that an organisation could take to get to a science-based target, and that comprises energy efficiency, which we've talked a lot about, particularly Jez, the investment in renewable energy, how you can get sustainable purchasing right to reduce emissions in your supply chain, things around eco-design that may be important for you, either what you're manufacturing or what you're buying. And then the pink box, that innovation yet to be found, that last hard bit of the trajectory. Bear that in mind, because I'll come back to it. So you can only set a formal science-based target at the highest legal entity. So if you're a UK-based subsidiary, you can't set a formal SBT, but you can still use the SBTI tool. It's free to use, and you can use it to set what your trajectory should be to stay within that 1.5 degree of warming. It's best to use the absolute contraction method, and I'll explain a little bit about that. And then to help you map out what are your risks, particularly around things like critical and emerging regulation that's going to affect you as an organisation, and the potential benefits, those disruptive positive innovations. What are the opportunities that you can map into your trajectory? So next slide. If this is new to you, the Science Based Targets Initiative are developing with Greenhouse Gas Protocol and other partners sectoral approaches. So the one on the screen to the left gives the established sectoral approaches for the ICT sector. The apparel and footwear sectoral reduction approach has been finalised. A lot of the others are all in progress. Forest, land and agriculture, it's still in a scoping phase. That's going to be particularly tricky. It's so complex, and the same for chemicals. So be aware of that. If it applies to you, use them, but otherwise use the absolute contraction approach, which is how do we get to absolute zero from where we are now? So next slide, please. This just illustrates it beautifully. On the left, the X is where we are now. We're out of balance with nature, with natural systems, and where we need to be is on the right, in balance. So the emissions that we're creating are being removed by natural systems. And this is from the SBTI slide set on the new net zero standard. The little bit at the bottom talks about carbon removals. So this is offsetting and insetting, and it can be done through technological removal, or it can be done through working with nature, land-based solutions, regenerative agriculture, etc. So next slide, please. This is the global net zero standard. It doesn't replace the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is about how you account for your emissions and reductions, and this standard is about how you get to net zero. So the two work hand in hand. 1, 2 and 4 are the most important bits. One is the immediate or near-term emissions reductions that you can achieve. 2 is about the longer term and science-based targets, so that you're using that evidence, that good science base to set out what your trajectory is. Number 3 is a good to do. It's what can you do outside of your own organisation and supply chain. And then 4 is about how you can neutralise those residual emissions you absolutely cannot get rid of. There may be some things that you need to do. You may need some element of global travel, aviation. If aviation hasn't got to net zero, you're still offsetting emissions, but you can't avoid those. What can you do to remove those emissions? And SBTI will be coming out with guidance on credible offsetting and credible insetting and abatement measures. So they are valid, but they've got to be done credibly, and they've got to be done transparently. Next slide, please. if these are not familiar to you, I would really strongly advise you to go to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and learn all of these so that you can remember them in your sleep. These are the global standards for greenhouse gas accounting across all scopes. They're constantly being reviewed and updated, and the one on the right is for policymakers. There's another one for projects. There's a lot of really good advice and guidance behind these publications. They are the global standards. You don't really need to look at anything else because the ISOs are all based around these. PAS 2060, publicly available standard. I would advise you to go to Greenhouse Gas Protocol as your first point of call. Next slide, please. When you're reporting your emissions and what you're doing to reduce them, I'd like to say something about carbon assurance. But reporting, you can only manage and reduce what you're measuring. So make sure that your data collation and reporting have been done as part of your day-to-day operations, that you can automate it as far as possible to reduce the amount of manual error and make it really, really easy. Use the ISOs for environmental management systems 14001 and for energy management systems 50001 as effectively as you possibly can. We have clients who are both who are certificated both, but we've still found through an updated audit that they can reduce a further 13% of their on-site energy use through efficiencies, through behaviour. So encourage these kind of reporting practices in your supply chain with your key suppliers. Establish that value chain. And especially if you're looking at insetting and offsetting or publicly reporting, get your annual footprint verified by an accredited independent auditor. It's not a regulatory requirement, but it's really worthwhile. And it's really good for reputation, for brand reputation, for your reputation as a credible and serious, if you're serious about achieving net zero. It doesn't cost a lot and it's well worth doing. Next slide, please. Materiality. What's absolutely material to your footprint and what can you disregard for now? We've made the point throughout this webinar this morning that supply chain is almost certainly the biggest component of your footprint. You need to determine the acceptable percentage or absolute quantity difference between your emissions inventory and what the emissions would be if all emitted sources were accounted for. Roughly 5% is the line. Anything that's below 5% you can not worry about too much for now. If it's 5% or above, if that's likely to be an error in calculation, that's what you need to look at. And it's best to get a third-party verifier involved because you can't mark your own homework really. It's better to get somebody who does this day in, day out to just check through how you're accounting for your emissions and their reductions. If a verifier thinks that you've admitted something that needs to be included because there's a material discrepancy, take notice of what they say. Next slide, please. I wanted to end on this. I got it from the Main Roads Western Australia Authority, but it's a really nice graphic of a good environmental management system. It's about the Plan, Act, Do, Review process in a little bit more detail. It sets out the importance of leadership, top management, the planning that we've talked about, the need to support all of those measures with the resources, the competency and the communication throughout the organisation, the operational controls, how you'll progress in your performance and what further improvements need. It's that iterative cycle of continuous performance improvement. So I
I think we've lost Carol. Her internet seems to have failed her, unfortunately. That's one of the risks of doing webinars and online meetings. But Michael, can we hand over to you?
Absolutely, thank you for that, and sorry to lose Carol at the end. Right, okay, so I'm Mike Diamond. I'm the Energy Officer for Bournemouth University. I handle the operational side of things in terms of building operation and carbon reduction across the estate, and also project management on trial basis for trialing new and emerging technologies and procedures within the organisation in order to further reduce our carbon emissions. So the main topic of conversation today for me is going to be our CCAP, our Climate and Ecological Crisis Action Plan, which is essentially our new carbon management plan. It replaces our old carbon management plan, which was set to achieve a 40% reduction in scopes 1 and 2 emissions by 2020. We exceeded this and managed to achieve 44% reduction in scope 1 and 2. The CCAP aims to achieve net zero by 2030, but beyond that, it's an all-encompassing plan based around the UN SDGs to cover more than just technological innovation, but it also covers behaviour, cultural and educational change. So next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, oh, hang on a second. Yeah, there's been a significant shift in the media focus on the climate change issue, thanks to the influence of high-profile activists. Organised activist groups like Extinction Rebellion have mobilised, and demonstrations have been gaining high-profile media attention. So this has been a catalyst for policy changes nationally and locally. And in June, obviously the government declared June 2019, government declared carbon net zero target by 2050. Also at a local level for Bournemouth University, the Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council has made a net zero commitment by 2030 along with Bournemouth University. Next slide, please. A good way that we've found of gauging this is through reputation and league tables. So we have a first class award from People and Planet, and we're in the top 100. Well, we're actually in the top 80 and have been improving further within the Times Higher Education rankings. So next slide, please. Okay, so going back to the carbon management plan, which I mentioned earlier, we've got a strong track record of carbon reduction. Obviously 2020 is a bit of a strange year in terms of our usage as an organisation, but we've kind of discounted 2020 and 2021's data in a lot of respects because we're not operating as business as usual. But we have managed to achieve a 45% reduction over the past 15 years, and this has primarily been due to investment in low and zero greenhouse gas tech, efficiency improvements across the estate, and also staff and student engagement. And not to be forgotten, a huge impact has been the grid decarbonisation. So the decarbonisation of the national grid has made things a lot greener for everyone, but it's not something that should be relied upon. Next slide, please. So the main objectives within our CCAP is leadership. So we want to be leading by example, both within the professional sphere and the educational sphere. So as an organisation, we want to be leading by example, but we also want to be leading by example to our students, of which I think we've got about 14,000 at the moment. And part of the CCAP, which goes on to point 2, is aligning the education and research with our crisis response. So the education side for those 14,000 students is a key responsibility, and would be, as part of the CCAP, been embedding the UN SDGs within our course syllabus across all courses. So there is now a requirement that every single course needs to cover the SDGs. We've got to focus on implementing nature-based solutions. So those solutions may not be coming directly from us as a staff level, we take feedback from students as well. We run workshops with MBA students as well as other courses, and we've had some really good suggestions come through that from that area, such as a wetlands project for increasing the carbon sequestration rates and increasing the health of local wetlands, which is something that we're looking at and trying to actively pursue. So engagement and behaviour change is another thing that we've been focusing on as part of the CCAP, and this covers both staff and students, but primarily staff, because student behaviour change is more impacted through the student union, but we do work closely as a sustainability team with the student union's sustainability team to be able to have that influence amongst the student body. Rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions through technological solutions. Again, I'll be coming on to what we've been doing in that front later on in the presentation. Implementing net zero carbon capital development. As a lot of this has comes down to our design standards and construction standards, which have been modified and are continuing to be reviewed annually. So I'm currently going through the process of reviewing our design standards for this year, which will take effect next year to improve our any retrofit or construction works that we're doing. Implementing net zero carbon capital development, I've just said. Managing climate change risk, data management and reporting. That is a really crucial part of how we've got to this point, and to continue on is reporting and data. So in order to do the reporting, we need to collect data. We have not perfect, but a good level of metering and monitoring across our estate, both in terms of utility levels, so gas, water, electricity, biomass, LPG, for the various systems that we're running, but also for waste data, procurement data. We need that data in order to be able to report on it, and that's the foundation of which everything is built upon. Next slide, please. Now, this just goes into a little bit more detail about what I was saying a second ago, and kind of where we're going with the lead. For example, emissions reductions. That is also includes our fleet, which has been almost completely electrified now. Academic opportunities. This is something that we're addressing, where, especially with regards to equality, there has historically been problems within academia, but predominantly down to travel. But it is something that we're making a concerted effort to try and rectify. Right, next slide, please. So this is basically covering the scopes 1, 2, and 3. Biggest problem, as has been mentioned previously, I think it was George that was saying about supply chain, understanding the supply chain. Scope 3 emissions are a huge headache in order to establish what they actually are as an organization, because reporting from our suppliers may not be as good as we'd like, and trying to get that information is incredibly difficult. We are trying to reduce our scope 3 emissions, and our net zero aim includes scope 3, but to a limited capacity based on what we can report and what we can monitor. So we are working closely with procurement in that respect in order to try and get an understanding of what our emissions actually are in regards to scope 3, which is going to be covered on the next slide. So next slide, please. So this just gives our current understanding of the scope 3 emissions through procurement and construction, which kind of give a scope to the problem that we're facing in terms of, or the significance of scope 3 and what its impact is on our carbon emissions. So these are estimated figures for the procurement and construction, because as I said, it is incredibly difficult to obtain that data. So we're not quite operating blind but we're in the same position that most organizations are in that trying to get that data is incredibly difficult, especially for smaller organizations where you don't have the same purchasing power as a large multinational, for instance. Next slide, please. So as has been previously mentioned, in terms of science-based targets and our different scenarios, within the scope, within our CCAP, we have 4 scenarios that we can follow. Now, the only scenario that actually goes below the science-based target trajectory is scenario D. So obviously that's the one that we're focusing on in order to achieve our targets. And through those scenarios, they include the technological and behavioral changes that can be made within the organization in order to achieve those reductions. So next slide, please. And this is an example of some of those scenarios and some of the changes. So the table at the top basically gives a few of the measures that we're focusing on. Heat switch, where 2A and 2B are 2 different scenarios. 2A covers one of our campuses, our main campus. 2B covers the entire estate. And then we're looking at things like PV implementation, so solar panels, reduction in flights, the transition to EV for our fleet vehicles, which bar a couple of minibuses and a Luton van has already been achieved, and the electrification of our bus, well, I say our bus fleet, but the bus fleet used as part of our Unibus contract. So where the nice thing about the CCAP is it has been designed to give us choice so that we can mix and match amongst our solutions as to whatever is going to be most beneficial at the time, both financially and time-wise, in order for and resource-wise for implementation. Next slide, please. So with the leading, for example, one of our faculties, the Faculty of Media and Communications, we've been engaging with them, and again, they've incorporated the UN SDGs within their course as part of both the education side and the research side of what they're doing. So that's impacts what their consumption rate is, and it certainly makes the students and the staff far more aware of the impact that they're having on an individual level to the organization's carbon emissions, which is a great foundation for starting that behavioral change process. And what we've seen in one of our newer buildings is, since the introduction with the UN SDGs for that faculty, in the courses for that faculty, there has been behavioral changes within the student body and the academic staff to reduce their consumption. And it can be things as simple as turning the lights off, even though we've got absence detection in the seminar rooms. But that absence detection will leave the lights on for half an hour following the room being empty, whereas switching the lights off saves half an hour of usage on the lights. Again, that's a really simple example of the types of changes that are happening, but if these are happening across the organization, they soon start adding up. Next slide, please. So another part that we're focusing on is opportunities for both student and staff involvement. And again, this goes on to the behavioral change. So sustainability challenge is something that's been set up to encourage students to develop sustainable project ideas, and businesses, and also sustainability-based businesses that can be supported by the university. Green Rewards is a staff-focused project where it's an online web portal where staff log in once a week to log their activities. So that could be walking to work, or recycling, or switching lights off, etc. And it's basically it's a gamification of sustainability, and we've had really good engagement and results from there. CAST is elements of the student body, and we've actually got a cast volunteer working, 2 cast volunteers working within the sustainability team at the moment, and 1 working directly with the energy team. And the climate justice now has been a movement taken on by a lot of the areas within the university. Next slide, please. Okay, so to summarize the CCAP so far, targets to achieve net zero by 2030-2031 academic year. And this is through education of staff and students, research into new technologies and ways of living that can minimize harm to the natural world, to cut our greenhouse gas emissions as quickly and as far as possible, and then invest in gold standard offsets for the remaining emissions. You'll notice that I've not really mentioned offsetting until this point. Our focus is very much on reduction first, offsetting second, and it's almost a dirty word within the organization at the moment, just because we don't want there to be any focus on offsetting as a get out clause. And we want to strengthen the partnership with students, staff and external organisations to affect change across the business and society. And next slide, please. So this is just an example of the sorts of projects we've undertaken up to this point. So we've got about 500 kilowatts peak worth of solar PV on our estate. We have been trying to get wind turbines installed, but planning, as I'm sure everyone's aware, can be a bit of a problem in that regard. Ground source heat pumps have been added to the design standards for primary space heating and new builds. And with our next new build that's hopefully going to be commencing in the next couple of years, the aim is to move away from gas entirely and have the entire building heated through preferably a heat pump based solution. Another option that we're looking at is deep geothermal. That's going to be a bit further down the timeline though, because it's a 10-year project. We've rolled out LED lighting across the entire estate, including stadium lighting for our sports ground, and also our new FMC, so Media and Communications building, where all the studio lighting is now LED, and trying to procure that was tricky. Big thing that's often missed is IT optimization. So IT is a huge user of energy across the estate. We've been, as part of the energy team, we've been supplying and fitting new UPSs, so uninterruptible power supplies for all of the comms rooms, which has reduced the consumption of the comms rooms by on average 6%, which doesn't sound like a lot until you realize these are 24/7 operating environments that are high energy consumers. It makes a big difference. Also, we're just at the stage of installing our first fresh air cooling system into a comms room with DX failover. So that just means that essentially it's cooled using a fan, a couple of vents, and it's using convection. And then air conditioning, if that fails, it knows basically the air conditioning then will kick in, go, oh, hang on, we're not getting the cooling supply, capacity that we need. We'll fire up the aircon. We've also electrified the fleet, as I've been saying, as I said a minute ago. We're currently in the replacement, having just completed our second of 3 high voltage transformers to be replaced across our main campus. Again, this will reduce our campus and our Talbot campus energy consumption by about 3%, electricity consumption by about 3% through efficiency improvements. We have a biomass boiler which caters for the vast majority of our heating load of our largest building. I know biomass is a little bit of a contentious one in terms of sustainability, but the greenhouse gas emissions all are dependent on the sourcing of the fuel for the boiler. So our fuel is sourced locally from about 7 miles away from a forestry project, so it's entirely renewable. We also, George asked me to include, we've also got a stranded asset, which is our CHP, which failed a couple of years ago, but due to the decarbonisation of grid electricity and the increasing cost of gas, it's no longer viable to repair and operate. So we're looking for alternatives and removal of our CHP. And that's about it from what we've been doing as a university. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Michael. We are running over, so I'm going to make this this last section as quick as I possibly can. I don't want to rush things, but obviously everyone's time is valuable. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, well, I didn't actually want those up there, but they're there. So some net zero gains, and these aren't actually relevant to all of these. The examples I wanted to use specifically to these organisations I'm not using, but I'm going to just quickly run through a few, and one that affects us all. Over the last 7 years, the UK electricity sector has decarbonised by around 66%, and that has meant decisions such as Michael just mentioned there, his CHP plant at the university becoming a stranded asset, because from a carbon perspective, of course, if your electricity is decarbonised to the extent that it has been and will continue to be, then the benefits of CHP actually aren't there anymore. So the choice not to spend thousands of pounds on repairs, etc., is a valid one. Also, in terms of transport, which is very visible, and one of the first things that a lot of organisations tend to do is they put in LED lighting because it's very visible, and they think, vehicles, let's change out our fleet where we can to EVs. And that has continued. In September, just gone, 15% of all vehicles sold in the UK were full electric vehicles. So that's a huge change from where we were at only a few years ago. And obviously with the advances in battery technology and range and infrastructure, then I can only see that going one way. And thirdly, one of the key actions for me, which really piqued my interest when we began our own transition to become a broad and net zero business, was the actions that the finance sector are taking. So investors are choosing, and investment companies are increasingly choosing not to invest in non-sustainable businesses, and particularly the obvious ones are oil and gas businesses, but any business that is not deemed to be sustainable, or at least on their journey to become, on their way to become net zero, investors are turning their backs on and choosing to divest and invest elsewhere. One of my favourite quotes is from Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, who said that those businesses choosing not to be sustainable won't be in business in 10 years' time. And I think statements like that, and also the raising of awareness by individuals such as Greta Thunberg and David Attenborough, of course, has really resonated in boardrooms and made that connection between net zero and the realities of business. So sustainability, we all think of it in an environmental sense, but from a business perspective, it's very much about the sustainability of that business. So net zero has to be absolutely central to businesses. And we talked, certainly heard from Michael and Jez and others about some of the things that companies have done, focusing on scope 1, scope 2, because that's the things that are obvious day to day. And some great things have been done there. Behavior change playing a massive part in that. But it's interesting, we in the last few months did some site energy and environmental audits for one of our clients, and despite them being ISO 50001, which is the international standard for energy management systems, we discovered that in practice it wasn't really as effective as it might otherwise have been. And we found that there was an opportunity, an immediate opportunity, through changes in behavior change, i.e. people not leaving plant on, not leaving lights on, etc. And this was going on sometimes. Plant was being left on the entire weekend when nothing was happening in that particular site. That could immediately reduce emissions by 13% in scope 1, scope 2. And that's significant. And there are lots of other opportunities as well. And then we're obviously working with that client, looking at their Scope 3 emissions through their supply chain, and there'll be huge opportunities there, no doubt. But even those businesses, the point being that even those businesses that feel they're doing the right things, have the standards, in actual fact, these things need to be looked at on a regular basis and challenges made, because you may find that it's not working the way you think. So yeah, some really interesting stuff there. And of course, you know, if we were to run this webinar in another 12 months time, there'll be a whole list of improvement measures, and I could go on and I could talk about all sorts of things about reducing waste. We've done some life cycle carbon analysis on individual products and materials and ingredients, and that's been really interesting. For one fashion retailer, they asked us to look at a particular product of theirs, which we did, and the reductions that were achieved by changing out the materials, the packaging, and the transport were significant. It was between 50 and 60 tons per year just on one product, and they have hundreds of different products. So there is lots that can be done. It may seem daunting at first, but it's all very doable, and we have to take these steps, and we have to put net zero into action on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, please, Rob. And just conscious of letting people go. Over to one of our shining stars, Connie, to talk to us about TCFD.
Thanks, George. And you set me up nicely to talk about legislation, and particularly the TCFD. So can you start on the next slide, please? So as George discussed earlier, the pandemic has shown us how quickly change can happen when governments and all of us are under pressure. Anticipation for action has been running really high in the wake of COP26, which, whilst gleaned varying commitments, the success of the pledges that were made will require support of strong legislative measures, so sort of change is imminent. Hosting the COP26 put the UK in the spotlight, prompting a range of announcements throughout the fortnight, prefaced by Boris Johnson's slogan, coal, cars, cash and trees. And the cash element has focused on the development of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures Initiative, the TCFD, that mandates that some businesses demonstrate their resilience to the effects of climate change to their capital providers. So that's very much what George was saying about investors being able to sort of really look into how companies are managing net zero and their environmental impacts. The introduction of the TCFD legislation is incoming, so it's important that businesses implicated understand what it will mean for them, and for those who aren't currently implicated to be prepared for future changes. So on the next slide, I'll briefly outline what's required under the TCFD and who's affected. The next slide, please. The TCFD is the first reporting development that, instead of considering how am I affecting the climate, addresses how is the climate likely to affect me. And as I said, it's intended to help mainstream investors to ascertain whether climate-related risk is appropriately priced into their valuation of your company. So if you're required to make disclosures, it's in your interest to have strong measures in place to buffer climate-related risk and capitalise on opportunities. It's useful to climate mitigation efforts as it provides a consistent framework for organisations to consider a realistic picture of how they may be affected by climate change, rather than them using their own parameters. So starting in the new financial year, whether that be January for some companies this year or April coming, companies with over 500 employees that fall into one of the following categories will have to make disclosures within their strategic report. So that's all UK companies that are currently required to produce a non-financial information statement, UK alternative investment market companies, any other UK companies who have a turnover of more than 500 million, and companies set up as a limited liability partnership. So on to the next slide, and I will outline the recommendations. So it's a framework that covers 11 recommendations that are organised into 4 categories. So starting with governance, companies must Describe your board's oversight and your management's role in addressing climate-related risks and opportunities. Under strategy, you must describe climate-related risks and opportunities to your company over time, outline their impacts on your strategy and the resilience of that strategy in different climate scenarios. Under risk management, you must describe your organization's processes for identifying and managing risks and describe how they're integrated into your overall risk management. And finally, under metrics and targets, you must disclose the metrics used by your organization to assess climate-related risks and opportunities, disclose scopes 1, 2, and where appropriate, scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and the related risks, and describe the targets used by your organization to manage climate-related risks and opportunities and performance against targets. So that's a very brief look at that, and there's lots of information provided on the TCFD website that goes into detail about how you do those things. As I've mentioned, disclosures are centered around risks and opportunities, which, as Carol explained earlier, is also an important thing to think about when developing a net zero strategy in general, not just for this initiative. For some companies, climate change, or for most companies, climate change presents significant risk to the viability of your business. This doesn't just involve physical environmental impact. There are many additional risks from transitioning to a lower carbon economy, and these could arise sooner than many people think. For example, transferring to renewable energy for a company reliant on high energy inputs could pose a risk if the renewable source can't keep up in the way that the fossil fuel source can. So that's something that they would need to consider in their report. On the other side, with change comes opportunities, which are actions that work with the changing economy that bring gains to your company. So, for example, more extreme rainfall, which is expected, we can sign better rainfall harvesting in urban developments. So we need to adopt systems thinking in order to work with change and make the most out of change. So next slide, please. Whilst the size and the scope of the TCFD may expand over time, the framework now has merit for companies for whom it's not currently applicable. Considering climate-related risks and opportunities across company practices and strategies will be essential for future-proofing businesses for changing global economies, and as I said, for developing a net zero plan, as well as investors becoming more discerning when it comes to companies' climate-related resilience thanks to TCFD. Consumers and procurement teams are increasingly making decisions based on companies' abilities to prove that they can understand their environmental impacts and are taking the necessary steps to mitigate them. So to summarize, using the techniques that we've all discussed today to develop a strong net zero plan will help to prepare your company ahead of future legislations and markets. And in fact, under new Treasury rules in 2023, a net zero plan in line with the 2050 target will be a requirement for most large firms in the UK, which just goes to show that it will soon be a must, not an option. So now's the time to get the ball rolling. Thank you. So I think I'm handing back to George. Oh, you're on mute there, George.
Next slide, please, Rob. Yeah, I mean, we've seriously overrun, so apologies for that. I hope it hasn't caused anyone too much inconvenience. What next? I guess what next depends on where you're at in terms of your own net zero journey. This slide shows the 6-stage process that we take our clients through to get to net zero. But increasingly, we're finding organisations are at different stages of this. Some have an outlined strategy, some have group targets, but don't have a net zero strategy that's specific to their own organisation or site. So we can help in whatever way is required. And I think just really to summarise in the interests of time and allowing people to get away and get on with their day, I'd like to thank all of our presenters who I think gave some very, very interesting insights into their own net zero journeys and some generic universal truths about it. 3 key areas I would focus on is, well, 4 key areas is: 1, now is the time for action. We've done enough talking. Time is not on our side, and we have to take action. We have to take those steps. We have to be brave, and we have to implement aggressively our net zero strategies. And those net zero strategies have to include Scope 3. For a lot of organisations, Scope 3, in fact, all organisations, Scope 3 accounts for the vast majority of their GHG emissions. And those GHG emissions sit largely within their supply chain. So supply chain engagement, understanding your supply chains, engaging them and helping them on their own journeys and encouraging them to reduce their own emissions will get us all to where we need to be a lot quicker. And the role of behaviour change, I think hopefully that point's come across. It's low cost, quick wins, and once you've changed the culture of organisation, it's changed forever. It has huge benefits. I know from my own personal experience of walking around sites and going into complex manufacturing environments, there are always huge opportunities from changes in behaviours, and I cited a few examples, as others have as well. There have been some significant steps forward in terms of decarbonisation of the grid. You know, more and more of our transport is becoming fully electric. That in itself brings its own challenges, as does even the decarbonisation of the grid in terms of leaving stranded assets. And it does mean that we have to think holistically about everything we're doing. And net zero isn't something that sits on one side. It has to be an integral part of any organisation's strategy, because it's so critical to the future of your organisation and the future of all of us. And Connie, lastly but not least, spoke about TCFD. And as I think we've all witnessed, reporting is increasing, it's becoming more onerous, it's becoming mandatory. You know, SCCR is one of them, ESOS, TCFD, etc. So transparency and the need to report and the need to be not only talking about action and net zero plans, but actually to start doing it and reporting the impacts of that. So I'd like to thank everyone that remains on this webinar for your time today. I'm sorry we've overrun, but as you can tell, we're all very passionate about what we believe in and what we have to do as a planet for the human race to survive. In terms of questions, if there are any, please feel free to send them to myself or Jane or any of the presenters, and we'll share those with and the responses to those with everyone in the coming days. Also, if anyone would like a copy of the slides, then please send us an email, get in contact, and we'll send those out to you. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your valuable time today. Thank you to the presenters, and enjoy the rest of your day.